So I'm going to make this video about what I personally think the order of the progressive stack is right now. Now, for those of you who don't know, the progressive stack is essentially the entire concept in leftism and liberalism of who is the most victimized. So it's kind of like rock, paper, scissors. It's kind of like, well, X group is disadvantaged, but Y group is even more disadvantaged. So therefore, the person in Y group is the bigger victim than in X group. And it's often used to determine the outcomes of situations where intersectionality intersects with itself. Like, you got a black woman and a white man, or a white woman and a black man. Like, actually, it wouldn't apply to the black woman and the white man. That would be pretty obvious. But if it's like a white woman versus a black man, it's like, well, then how do you weigh the different factors? So that's basically what it is. And there's a few caveats I want to make first. Firstly, people's position on this list can change over time. And that's one thing I have noticed, is that when there's certain events happening, certain groups might be temporarily in the spotlight. And that could mean that their place on this list could go up or down temporarily. Like, for instance, during the big event of 2020 and 2021, East Asians were viewed negatively by many people as being, the source of the big event. So they were sometimes scrutinized, and there were cases of attacks against Asians. We don't know to what extent it was motivated by the big event specifically, but it very well may have been, given the timing. So temporarily, they may have ascended a little bit on the list as a result of that. Or say Hispanics during Donald Trump's first term, when he really made a big emphasis on the border wall and deporting people of Hispanic, illegal immigrants of Hispanic origin. Also Muslims after 9/11 and after certain other terrorist attacks. So yeah, that's one thing. Another caveat is that, again, like, where a group places on this list isn't necessarily a reflection of how victimized they actually are. Like, in my opinion, some of these groups actually have been victimized historically or are today. Others not so much. In some cases, maybe they have been victimized, but they use it to their advantage and just sort of use it to manipulate other people. So yeah, it's not really a judgment per se of whether or not they've actually been victimized. It's just a ranking of where progressives essentially, like, how they view them, like how much victim cred they get. Also, when I mentioned, okay, if you're somebody who belongs to multiple categories on this list, basically your placement on the list is determined by the highest category that includes you. So whatever is the highest on the victim tier list, like that makes you the most victimized, that's where you place on the list, even if you are part of multiple categories. So I hope that should explain. That's also why I don't include certain categories, because if you're part of, like, let's say I don't include men on the list, and that's because if you're a man, where you're placed is essentially according to what other category you embody on the list. Like, if that's confusing, I'll explain further as I go on the list. But yeah, same with, like, being straight, for instance. So if you're straight or if you're a man, it would simply be determined by, yes, but what race are you? What ethnicity are you? And that would determine where you are on the list. However, with women, I do actually have women as a specific category on the list, which would mean if you're a woman and you belong to a race that is listed below women on the list, I mean, congratulations, you go up several notches because you are a woman, and that is your highest category on the list. So I hope that makes sense. And same is true for gay men. I have them as their own category too. So I hope that makes, and transgenders. So I hope that makes sense. So without further ado, here's the list. And it's starting at the beginning with the most victimized, the highest in the victim hierarchy. Okay, so S tier. First off is the Jews, and I have them at the very top of the list. And the reason is they can literally get away with bloody murder. I don't know anyone else who can do what Israel does right now and yet still be commended by basically every Western country, still be considered an ally and praised and given standing ovations. Not only that, but even in left liberal circles, there's a lot of criticism of Israel. However, they are always very careful to not cross certain lines. They always make the emphasis to say, well, it's not Jews at large we're talking about, it's Israel. However, with any other conflict, they will not do this. They will not make any distinction between the Russian ethnic group and the Putin regime. They will not make any distinction between the German ethnic group and the NSDAP during World War II. They will not make any distinction between white Southerners as a whole and the Confederates. So Jews get this privilege that no one else gets, where it's like they can completely disassociate themselves from the actions of the state of Israel and say that they have no involvement, wash their hands of it, even though there are pro-Israel signs in front of virtually every synagogue you'll ever see. Even though in neighborhoods that are even remotely slightly Jewish, you will see signs like bus stop ads for Israel bonds literally everywhere. Even though there's flyers, posters, pro-Israel stuff everywhere if you're in an even remotely Jewish neighborhood. Despite all these things, there's this idea, well, the Jewish people at large cannot be held responsible for the state of Israel by affiliation. It's like, okay, if you want to go down that road and say that individual people shouldn't necessarily be blamed for the actions of a regime associated with them, I might agree with that to an extent. But the thing is, you're not applying that same standard to the Germans or the Russians or anyone else, so fuck you guys. No. Fuck you guys for making that distinction. So the fact that they're able to get away with so much, and the fact that they're like per capita one of the wealthiest groups, I think of any ethnic group, they might be the wealthiest, although, well, probably not, because you have some ethnic groups where there's literally like 10 or 20 members of them. Like there's like certain ethnic groups there's hardly any people of, so it's like, oh, the ex-Americans, like let's say, oh, there's 10 Kiribati Americans, like people from the island of Kiribati, and oh, they happen to be wealthier than the Jews on average. But I mean, my point is, of any major ethnic group, I'm pretty sure they are the wealthiest in the United States. I could be wrong, but yeah, and by and large in the world, I would guess of any major religion, they're probably the wealthiest on average. And who knows, they could be the wealthiest major ethnic group in the world. I'm not sure on that. I don't have the exact statistics, but nonetheless, they are very disproportionately overrepresented in Ivy League schools, in like academia as a whole, banking, finance, media, government, and yet they are still able to portray themselves as a victim group. Like they're white when it's strategic, but when it's not strategic, they're non-white. And I don't think anybody else has so successfully portrayed themselves as a victim group while at the same time actually being quite powerful and quite successful. I mean, some of the other groups on this list do fit those criteria. Like there are other groups that have been very successful and yet still portray themselves, whether correctly or incorrectly, as victimized. But nonetheless, I don't think anybody has done it anywhere near as successfully as the Jews. So for all that combined, I'm going to put them at the very top of the list, but I will say it is debatable because it depends what criteria you use. Like I'm taking into account not only how high they are on the progressive stack, but also the shit they get away with that should earn them condemnation by progressives if progressives are being consistent. And I mean, yes, many progressives do condemn the actions of the state of Israel, but they are very careful to differentiate it from the Jews as a whole and to clarify that they're not speaking about the Jewish community as a whole, and that just because you're Jewish doesn't mean you should be affiliated with this, that people should blame you for the actions of the state of Israel. So by doing that, I think they do keep Jews entrenched in the top spot. So number 2, still in S tier, is black people. Now this one's pretty obvious, like with Black Lives Matter and everything, like across the world, like there were Black Lives Matter protests in countries that hardly have any black people and that drew thousands or millions of protesters. And it was just, in some ways, it felt like imitating America, just like in so many ways that Europeans imitate America. Like when I see these massive Black Lives Matter protests in Berlin. It's like, okay, you guys are just imitating America. It's literally like that Rammstein song, "We're all living in America." And yeah, but nonetheless, okay, people definitely take after America in this regard, putting blacks high on the list. Like even in countries that don't have a very high black population, black people are seen as the perennial victim group. And it is true that black people do tend to be at the near the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder in most places where they go. Also, they tend to be overrepresented among the incarcerated or people with criminal records anywhere they go. So are they actually victimized? Yes. Are they unfairly victimized? That's another question. That is definitely another question. I mean, there's a huge can of worms to open here. All I will say is Jared Taylor has some very good books on the subject and videos and essays. So yeah, enough said about that. I'm being cautious here because, censorship and all. Frankly, there's a lot of shit I'm saying here that could be censored. But yeah, regardless though, yeah, they are very high on the political correctness hierarchy. And I've noticed black people are always overrepresented in certain things, like in advertising and other forms of media, but especially advertising. It's literally everywhere you go. Like, even if you're in a country with like a 1% black population, they'll be damn sure to put black people in every commercial and every ad. So yeah, I do think, and I do think also with blacks, they have shown a remarkable resiliency to avoid cancel culture. Like, they get away with a lot of shit, like criticizing other groups that are lower than them on the progressive stack, but still on the progressive stack. Like was it Kevin Hart? And a few of these black actors have made really anti-gay comments, and yet were not canceled for doing so. I think Dave Chappelle has got away with a lot of shit. Yeah, so I do think they have a certain pass, not just an inward pass, but a pass to say a lot of things that are otherwise considered offensive, and to criticize other groups beneath them. However, with Jews, which is partly why I put Jews so high on the list, black people who get a pass with everything else, if they start really criticizing Jews, they do get shit from the mass media, and they do get canceled. So it's like, okay, that seems to be the one line even black people aren't really allowed to cross. Like, even with Kanye, like, he had to really kiss ass to be forgiven after criticizing the Jews. So yeah, I mean, I'm gonna put blacks second highest on the list, but still in S tier. Third highest, still in S tier, is indigenous peoples. And one thing, like I said, like this list can vary a bit depending on what country you're in. I'm trying to do sort of an average for all Western countries, but it really depends what country you're in. So for this, indigenous peoples in Canada, I might put them maybe on par with blacks. I'm not going to put them higher with blacks, but I'd say in Canada, they might be on par with blacks. Whereas in the United States, I'd say they're a notch beneath blacks, but still in S tier. So indigenous peoples of the Americas and Australasia. So Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, basically. And also the Americas as a whole. I'm actually not sure if indigenous peoples from Latin America would be quite as high, because in Latin America, it gets a bit more murky and confusing, because often in most countries, the majority of the population is mestizo. So it's like, how do you differentiate between mestizo and indigenous? The lines do get a bit blurry. Whereas in North America, Canada, and the US, it's often more of a one-drop rule thing, where it's like, oh, if you have even a slight bit of indigenous ancestry, you'll identify as indigenous. Although it's not true for everyone, because there are some people who don't. But like, you get people like Elizabeth Warren trying to claim indigenous ancestry with 0.1% ancestry. So yeah, I mean, nonetheless, being indigenous does get you quite a bit of victim cred, because it is a big thing, like, within New World countries, this narrative of us being societies built on the genocide of the indigenous peoples. Now, that being said, I will say being indigenous probably doesn't get you as much victim credit if you're in a different part of the world. Like, for instance, If you're an Australian Aboriginal and you come to North America, I don't think I've ever seen an Australian Aboriginal in North America. Maybe like once or twice. I'm not sure if you get as much victim cred or vice versa if you're a Native American and you go to Australia. Definitely if you go to Europe, your victim cred probably won't be quite as high there. But that being said, a lot of Indigenous people don't tend to do that. Like, I don't see that kind of thing very often, where they will move to a totally different part of the world. They might move back and forth between Canada and the US, but not really to like totally different continents. So again, I'm not sure how that would work. Maybe between Australia and New Zealand, they might still get some cred, but moving to a totally different continent might reduce your victim cred in that regard. People may not care as much. But if you're on the continent that you're Indigenous to, then yes, it does get you quite a bit of cred within the progressive stack. So I put them slightly below blacks because I just think there's a bit less of an emphasis on them, on Indigenous people, in terms of the mass media, the educational system, how much emphasis they place on atrocities, whether real or alleged, committed against them compared to blacks. Like, I just think black people get a bit more emphasis, and also black people get that emphasis pretty much globally, whereas Indigenous people, it's like you really have to be in the part of the world that you're Indigenous to in order to be as high on the progressive stack. So I'm putting them on S tier, but they're at the low end of S tier. I will say, though, being Native in Canada is a bit like being black in the sense you can get away with talking a lot of shit and not be canceled for it. So I will say they do have that benefit. Okay, now on to A tier. So these are people who are still pretty high on the progressive stack, but just not quite as high. Actually, wait, A tier is only one group. I have only one group in A tier because they represent they occupy a very unique position, which is transgenders. Now, I would have a few years ago put transgenders in S tier, but I think they've actually gone down a notch. And I think it's because they were kind of the flavor of the month for a while. Not literally the month. I mean, they were the flavor for like years, maybe even like a decade or so. Like they were a really big deal for a while, but I think lately they've gone down a bit, and I think it's because we're this whole so-called post-woke era we're in. I think one area where conservatives have been thrown a little bit of a bone is that it is semi-acceptable within mainstream or semi-mainstream conservative circles to talk shit about transgenders as a group. It is not yet acceptable to do that for any of the three groups listed above, but I do notice in semi-mainstream right-wing circles, it has become increasingly acceptable to diss transgenders, to say, to make generalizations and to say negative things about transgenders as a whole. But yeah, that's something that wasn't necessarily the case a few years ago. I think actually, if anything, there is a little bit of truth to the narrative of post-woke in the sense that I do think the right has gotten a little bit more gloves off with transgenders lately, and they're a little bit more willing to criticize them as a group. So that's why I think they're slightly lower on the political correctness hierarchy than the ones on S tier above, but still pretty high. Because among woke leftists and liberals, they are still pretty high, but the fact that conservatives, like mainstream conservatives, like semi-mainstream conservatives, can get away with publicly criticizing this group as a group, like saying things that are like overtly like anti-transgender to some extent, I think does put them a bit below, because the fact that they're getting away with saying these things and they're not being totally canceled by everyone for it, to me means that, yeah, maybe transgenders have fallen a little bit in the political correctness hierarchy. So interestingly enough, okay, on to B tier, and the next in the list, very interestingly, is women. So this covers women as a whole. If you're not in one of the above groups and you're a woman, congratulations, you are at this level in B tier. And what's interesting is that, as I just mentioned, like women are below transgenders. So when you get into like TERF debates, like people like J.K. Rowling who criticize transgenders, but because J.K. Rowling does not belong to any of the groups above transgenders, she gets a lot of shit for it. She gets I wouldn't say I wouldn't necessarily say she's been flat out canceled, because there is still Harry Potter stuff. Like there's this HBO Harry Potter adaptation being made. So I mean, they haven't gotten rid of any Harry Potter stuff anywhere, really. So I mean, she hasn't been totally canceled, but a lot of liberals and leftists hate her now. So yeah, I mean, I do think transgenders as a whole are above women, because I do think in most situations transgenders are winning that conflict, the turf versus trans conflict. Although in some more conservative places, perhaps women are winning that conflict. Well, is it women who are winning, or is it simply the conservative base as a whole that's winning against them? It's a bit of both, but my point is I do put women below transgenders for that reason, because in liberal left circles, um, you know, rock beats scissors. Like, I mean, the transgenders still do beat the women, in where they literally and figuratively, yeah, with the whole sports thing, right? But yes, nonetheless, though, being a woman, despite the fact that I think transgenders edge them out in those debates, and again, most people, you go in any left liberal circle, usually they will side with the transgenders over the TERFs. Like, I'd say 80 to 90% of the time, they will side with the transgenders over the TERFs. However, that being said, I think that women do still have a good deal of cred, because the Me Too movement, hashtag believe all women, all that stuff is still taken very seriously among leftists and liberals. And in fact, it's one of the rare cases where there have been people who have succeeded in punching up on the progressive stack, which is there have been some women who in the Me Too movement have accused men who belong to some of the groups above them of harassment or, sexual violations, and have been successful with it. But nonetheless, I think just because they can punch up in that regard, I don't think it puts women at the very top, because there have also been many other cases in other contexts where women are scissors getting beaten by rock. Like, for instance, in the so-called Karen cases of white women being afraid of black men in public, liberals will nearly always side with the black men. And furthermore, if any time, the interesting thing is when it comes to like consent, white women, even with the emphasis on consent theory, they still don't say that it's legitimate for a white woman to reject a black guy because he's black. And it's like, hold on a second. If you truly wholeheartedly believe in the idea of consent, then that should include racist consent. It should still apply. It should be like, you know what? If she doesn't want to fuck black guys, she doesn't have to fuck black guys. But when they say that, like, no, you have to suck the black dick, or like, you have to come up with an excuse for not wanting to suck the black dick that has nothing to do with the dick being black. It's like, in that case, it's like the fact that they are making white women come up with that excuse, to me, indicates that women aren't at the very top of the hierarchy, despite the pretensions, hashtag believe all women. It's like, well, I think there's a few cases where they don't believe the woman, or at very least where they don't side with the woman. So I do think women are definitely fairly high in the hierarchy, but they're not at the top of the list. Although I will say women in the workforce have benefited more than almost anyone else from political correctness. And the groups they've primarily benefited over are the groups underneath them. And the thing is, even some of the groups above them just simply haven't made that many strides in the workforce, because they don't tend to be terribly high performing. Like transgenders, indigenous, blacks. The only one that really, I'd say, has done better in the workforce is at the very top, Jews. But women have just dominated so many white-collar industries to such a ridiculous extent. I've seen this personally a lot. There's definitely a femocracy at many jobs, and it's a type of nepotism that people do not talk about nearly enough. Because I think honestly, like being male is a big disadvantage in the workplace these days, at least in the white collar workplace. In blue collar jobs, it's probably different. But let me put it this way, I've still seen women succeeding more in getting into male dominated industries than I've seen men getting into female dominated industries. And not only that, but with men in female dominated industries, there's still a lot of stigma. Like I've seen so many threads online, on Reddit of women complaining about male nurses and stuff like that, being like, "Oh, they're all perverts, every last one of them," or "Oh, they're all toxic, they're all problematic." It's like it's very hard as men to make inroads into female-dominated professions, even gay men. It's probably slightly less hard for gay men, but there still is some of that, because ironically there's the hermeneutics of bisexual suspicion. There's this idea, oh, is he really totally gay? Or it's like, oh, he may be gay, but he's still a man and he could still be a toxic man. So, yeah, there is that. Sorry, 1 second. So, the next on the list is gypsies. Now, gypsies are a confusing one because they're mostly in Europe and it's mostly a European thing. It's not really much of a thing here in North America. I've seen gypsies here before. I once randomly saw a group of like 50 gypsies walk by in the park. It was such a Big Lipped Alligator moment. Like, it was so bizarre. It came out of nowhere. They just walked by like 50 gypsies and I never saw any of them again. It was really weird. But yeah, so there's that, but like, so the gypsies, that is a thing. Like, the gypsies in Europe are pretty high because there's the association with the Holocaust. There's also the idea that they're very stigmatized there, but a lot of people do criticize gypsies there, even people who are kind of liberal. So I guess that puts them a bit lower than some of the other groups, but they do get a fair amount of victim cred. They do get affirmative action in some countries. Like I know they do in Romania. I'm pretty sure they probably do elsewhere too. But yeah, they do get a fair amount of victim cred, but they also get a lot of hate. There are a lot of people who openly dislike them, even like kind of normie people. So they're not at the top of the list, but they're moderately high because there is a decent amount of advocacy and, you know, left liberal propaganda on their behalf. So yeah, next on the list after gypsies is Muslims. Now Muslims, I mean basically anybody who's Muslim who doesn't fit into any of the above groups. Like if you're black and Muslim, you'd be higher because you're black. But yeah, Muslims, Middle Easterners, North Africans, basically anybody who's Muslim or any other ethnic group. Like I would say this doesn't apply to white Muslims really. Like if you're like Bosnian, you'd be lower on the list, I still think. But most Muslim ethnic groups would be here. So like basically Arabs, any kind of Arab, Middle Easterner, North African, Pakistani, Central Asian. Indonesians would be hard to place. Like, it depends how dark you are, I guess. For Southeast Asian Muslims, I guess I'd put them here on the list, but it partly depends on how dark are they and how overtly Muslim are they. Like, do they wear Muslim clothing? But yeah, as a whole, I'm going to put Muslims here on the list. So this is, yeah, B tier, along with, yeah, women and gypsies, but lower on B tier than those groups. I think Muslims get some victim cred because they did milk the sympathy of, like, post 9/11, you know, post 9/11 discrimination and all that. But nonetheless, it's like, I mean, the very fact that, like, Western governments still actively shill for Israel, despite the fact that Israel is just mass murdering the Palestinians right now. To me, that means like Muslims they're on the list, but they're not super high. But that being said, they do get away with a lot, like in the case of Rotherham and the other grooming gang scandals in the UK. Just in the case of a lot of like petty crime and stuff like that across Western Europe. They do get away with a fair amount of shit, and people are frequently called racist for pointing these things out or for saying anything bad about them. But nonetheless, I don't think they're at the very top of the group of the list, and I think the way that the Israel-Palestine conflict is treated proves that. Because ultimately the progressive stack, it covers both the grassroots and the elite of the left. And because the elite of the left and liberals are, frankly, not very pro-Palestine, like they're not willing to take the gloves off in their criticism of Israel, and they're not willing to really call what Israel's doing genocide, and they're not willing to be nearly as harsh on Israel as they would have been on apartheid South Africa, for instance. Even though what Israel's doing is, in my opinion, far worse, because they're killing people on a scale that apartheid South Africa did not. So, yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm putting Muslims here on the list. They get away with some shit, but they also get shit on. They're at that point, where it's like, there's shit falling on them, but they're also shitting on those beneath them. So yeah, also at the very low end of B tier is Hispanics, mestizos, basically. They get some sympathy because of the fact that many of them are illegal immigrants in the United States, and being illegal always gets you a bit of cred on the political correctness hierarchy, like undocu, whatever. But I don't know. I mean, the fact that a lot of them voted for Trump, I mean, frankly, I think they're very threatened in their status on B tier. I think they could easily fall to C tier in a few years. I would not be surprised at all. As they're becoming more accepted by conservatives, that also means that liberals are going to be less inclined to automatically defend them. But nonetheless, I mean, they do get away with a fair amount. Like, in terms of, like, language activism in the US, they have really been able to push the Spanish language. Like, I'd say I see more Spanish in the US than I see French in Canada outside of Quebec. So that is something. Like, they have been quite pushy on the linguistic front, and they have made a lot of headway there. Not to mention just on the demographic front, like there's a lot of them. So, I mean, they're not super high, but they're not super low either, because they have gotten away with quite a lot. So yeah, that's Hispanics. Okay, on to C tier. At the top of C tier is Indians. So people from India, from the Indian subcontinent, that would include like Sri Lankans. So if they're not Muslim, or any of the other above mentioned group, Indians go here. Now, I think the thing about Indians is they don't have a super strong victim narrative. Like, I guess there's British colonialism of India, but like at the same time, like a lot of people were colonized at various points in history. I mean, it's not like their numbers were heavily reduced, that's for sure. They can't claim that like the indigenous peoples of the Americas or Australia or New Zealand can claim. There was no mass die-off from disease or deliberate killing or anything like that, And also there's the fact with Indians that, like, they don't commit as much crime as some of the above groups, and frankly, committing crime gets you put higher in the political correctness hierarchy. And there's also been a lot of open backlash against Indians because there's been a lot of Indian immigration lately, and a lot of people are upset with the obvious nepotism that Indians display in the workforce. And that criticism, at least in Canada, has actually gone fairly mainstream. Like, I see it in a lot of comment sections lately. A lot of people are really vocally pissed off about Indians, and they're not afraid about naming them in this context. And that's why I don't put them higher on the list, because some of the above groups people would be afraid to name more blatantly. Like, I mean, conservatives will for Muslims, previously for Hispanics, but now they love Hispanics. Hispanics are bro tier now because they voted for Trump. But for instance, with blacks or indigenous, or Jews, a lot of them are afraid to call them out by name. But with Indians, people will call them out by name, and they very often do. But nonetheless, the fact that they've got away with as much as they have means they're moderately high on the hierarchy. They're not super high. Next in C tier is gay and bisexual men. So again, this is if you don't fall into any of the above groups and you're a man and you're gay or bisexual. And by bisexual, I mean you have to actually like act on your gay side. You can't just be like, oh, I'm functionally straight, but sometimes I have fantasies about men. That doesn't. Somebody's definitely gonna isolate that clip and fuck you for doing it. But yeah, nonetheless, if that's what you're saying, then you're not that high on the hierarchy. But yeah, that's my point. It's like, if you're gay or if you are, like, basically if you're a man and you have sex with other men or you do sexual things with other men, like, it's not enough if you're like functionally straight but you're like, oh yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I looked at gay porn once and I was aroused by it, blah blah blah. Like, if you're in that category, that doesn't mean shit on the political correctness hierarchy. You have to be actively engaging in gay sexual relations of some form. So if you are, then this is where you are on the hierarchy. And there are a lot of, here's the thing, gays actually got really fucked over by progressives because it used to be that the rainbow flag was their thing, but now that's been taken away from them, and now literally every fucking group gets on the rainbow flag. Even black and brown people who aren't even a fucking sexuality. I guess unless it's like mud shark women. I guess in that case it's a sexuality, like with the Ace of Spades tattoo. But other than, I mean, it's not really a sexuality though. But I mean, that's my point, is they've had that symbol like literally snatched away from them. And if they were pissed at that, I would understand them being pissed about that. But nonetheless, I mean, you get some cred for being gay, but honestly not that much. There's a lot of gay men who are right-wing, like far right or far right adjacent, like Jack Donovan, for instance, and I don't see them getting very much, or Greg Johnson, probably, allegedly, but I don't see anybody really sticking up for them because they're gay. Whereas, for instance, when black guys go off the reservation and start saying really politically incorrect shit, they do avoid some amount of canceling and censorship by being black. So I don't know. I don't think that being gay or bi is really puts you that high on the hierarchy. Like, to be honest, like, I mean, I guess there is one thing they do get away with, which is they do get away with breaking laws on public nudity and, let's say, revealing more of your body in public than would typically be considered legally or socially permissible for men. They do get away with that. And I mean, that in and of itself, like, that and $5 will get you a cup of Starbucks coffee. So it's like, for whatever the fuck that is worth, they get away with that. Like, congratulations, you can get away with wearing a thong in public. Great, good for you, So it's like, although if you're in many parts of Europe, you can get away with that anyway, if you're a man, like in Italy. Oh my gosh. But yeah. My point is, I don't think they're really that high on the hierarchy. I guess where they have made inroads is getting churches to like flat out like undermine and denounce things that are actually written in the Bible. Like getting churches to just be anti-biblical. I guess they have succeeded in that regard. But nonetheless, I don't think they're as high as the above groups on the list. I mean, a lot of like really trad religious people would disagree and put them higher. I do think they're on the list. Like, I do think they have majorly, especially in regards to religion, subverted and undermined a lot of religious groups. But nonetheless, I just think that the other groups tend to trounce them all the time. And we could see this whenever gay men say politically incorrect shit. It's like them being gay men doesn't really get them that much leeway. So yeah, that's where they are. Lower than them on C tier is Southeast Asians. Um, Southeast Asians, again, they're kind of viewed as yellow. They're kind of viewed as brown. There's a bit of a spectrum there. I don't have that much to say about them. They're just kind of there, you know? Like, they're kind of, I guess, viewed as a little bit of a victim group, but not that much. Next on the list, at the lowest end of C tier, is Northeast Asians. So Chinese, Japanese, Koreans. Again, they're lower on the list because they're lighter skinned than Southeast Asians, and because the far right perception of Northeast Asians tends to be a bit more positive. Like, not just far right, but overall, like the stereotypes associated with Southeast Asians versus Northeast Asians, I would say the Northeast Asian stereotypes are more positive. I'd say they're positive for both, but even more so with Northeast Asians, because I think with Southeast Asians, there's the perception, which is accurate, that like most of them are, you know, well-performing, productive members of society, but there is like this like gang member underbelly, like this gang underbelly to the Southeast Asian community, and it's not as common among Northeast Asians. And, you know, involvement in certain types of crime like prostitution and gambling, I think, is more prevalent among Southeast Asians. So the fact that maybe they commit a little bit more crime than Northeast Asians puts them slightly higher on the political correctness hierarchy. But overall, both Northeast and Southeast Asians are not terribly high. So they're at the very bottom of C tier. Now D tier. D for disabled. The people on D tier are the disabled, if you don't fall into any of the groups above. So physically disabled are slightly higher than mentally disabled. But overall, being disabled in and of itself doesn't put you terribly high, despite the fact that being disabled really fucking sucks. Like, in terms of who's actually the most victimized, people with the worst disabilities should be at the very top of this list. Like, it fucking sucks being, like, severely disabled. It is horrible. It is absolutely horrible. And yet they still don't get as much fucking victimization cred as people who are just for being black or whatever, or female. Like, I think it's ridiculous, personally. If anybody deserves victim credits, people with more severe disabilities. Like, obviously, there's a whole spectrum of disabilities ranging from things that barely affect your life to things that absolutely ruin your life and could be actually worse than being dead, perhaps. Like, things that are so bad that I wouldn't wish them on anyone. Like, levels of suffering that people can't even comprehend. So it's like, again, like it's a whole spectrum, but overall being disabled just doesn't get you that much sympathy and cred compared to groups above. Now, granted, there are some disabilities that probably deserve to be low on the list because, I mean, there are some disabilities where it's like say for instance, like ADHD. Like, a lot of people have ADHD and can still succeed fairly well. Actually, autism is worse than ADHD. I have both, and autism is actually, in terms of the unemployment rate associated, autistic people have a very, very high unemployment rate. So in fact, I'd argue that being autistic is worse than having ADHD, although I'd say having both is probably worse than the sum of its parts. But yeah, I mean, I actually wouldn't put autism as, like, the least disadvantaged of, I'd say the least disadvantaged of disabilities would probably be like ADHD, maybe, or maybe like, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of high functioning people who are like bipolar or whatever. It's hard to say, but in terms of mental disabilities, I'd say the most actually victimized are probably like schizophrenics and people with like really severe mental problems. But yeah. Regardless of what it is, your physical or mental disability, it gets you some cred on the progressive stack, but honestly not that much. So that's D tier, D for disabled. And by the way, one thing I'm going to mention with this group, with this list, I'm only putting identity categories. I'm not putting things like how poor or rich you are, because honestly, that's very hard to quantify compared to like identity. And also poverty is just very, it's very fractal. That's the word, right? Like, where it can change a lot depending on your situation 1 year to the next or whatever. So, I mean, it's hard to quantify that. So I've left that out, but I'm keeping on. I'm basically putting identity categories here. I suppose being poor in and of itself, if you're not in any of the other categories, would probably put you in D tier. Homeless might put you in C tier. or maybe even B tier. But if you're poor and not homeless and you don't fit into any other categories, I would guess probably D tier. But again, it's a bit apples and oranges because poverty isn't really an identity category in the same way as like race, gender, religion, sexuality, or disability. It's not really considered an identity group per se. And again, if you're going to get into non-identity groups, we can go like rural, urban, suburban. We can go so many other groups like. So I've just, to not overcomplicate things, I've left it out. But for the record, I guess that's where poor or homeless people would be on the list. So E tier. Okay, usually people don't do E tier, but I'm putting in an E tier here because there's different levels. There's a lot of different levels. E tier is just white people as a whole. So if you're white and you don't fall into any of the above categories, you're E tier. You have white privilege. You're not a victim at all. Like fuck you, white man. Like this is where you fall, cracker, whitey. Yeah, you're fucking, yeah. Whitey is near the bottom of the list. I think this needs no explanation. Like the sheer volume of leftist and liberal vitriol against white people as a whole shows that being white does not get you any credit in the progressive stack and in fact is a negative. So you could be asking, okay, if white people are E tier, who the hell is F tier? Who the hell could possibly be below white people? Well, okay, I need to clarify. E tier is white people as a whole. However, there are white people who, okay, E tier is white people who don't fall into certain specific ethno-national groups of white people. However, if you do fall into these ethno-national groups of white people, congratulations, you are actually below E tier and you are at F tier. You are at the bottom of the fucking stack. So which specific white ethno-nationalities am I putting in F tier? Germans, Russians, Belarusians, Serbians, South Africans, and Southern Americans, like the Confederate States. So if you are one of these specific types of whites, congratulations, you are even lower than other white people. You are at the very fucking bottom of the list. If I had to say, okay, in order of... Okay, so from who is highest, so in other words, you're slightly higher in the victim category, slightly less hated by liberal left, to the most. Okay, I would put Southern US because they're still Americans, so they still get some credit for being good guys by virtue of being Americans. Next would be Serbians because it's mostly because of the Balkans War. There's still a bit of animosity over that, but a lot of people have forgotten about that by now. But there's also the fact that Serbia's been a bit cozy with Russia lately. This is hard because I'm putting Belarusians next because they get shit for being affiliated with Russia, but they're not technically Russia. So they're pretty low. I don't know because it's hard with actually, this is hard. I don't know who's at the very bottom because I'd say right now Russians are at the very bottom. However, that could be just a moment in history thing. I think overall Germans might be at the very bottom because they get so much shit over World War II. They are never going to live that one down. Ever. So I don't know. Are Germans or Russians or maybe white South Africans, they do get a lot of shit also. And also people will openly celebrate them being brutally murdered even today with like the farm killings. So South Africans, and I'm also including like whites in Zimbabwe or other Southern African countries. I don't know who's at the very bottom of the list. Is it Germans, South Africans, or Russians? It's very hard to say. And Russians, it's obviously because of the current conflict in the Ukraine. That's one thing I should mention. Temporarily, Ukrainians are above other whites, but they're still in E tier because they're still white. But they're temporarily at the top of E tier. So congratulations if you're Ukrainian and you don't fit in any of the other categories, you are temporarily slightly above other white people. So good on you for that, Ukraine. But yeah. F tier, yeah. And when I say German and Russian and South African, there's a question of like, okay, what if you're from one of these ethnic backgrounds, but you live in another country? I don't know. It really depends how close your ties are to that country. Like in my case, I'm mostly German by blood, but like I don't have any really close ties to Germany or Austria, despite my ancestors coming from there. So I don't know how much that affects me personally. It would affect me a lot more if I was German living in Germany or Austria. When I say Germans, yeah, I'm including ethnic Germans in Austria also, and I guess Switzerland too. I don't know. Maybe less so Switzerland slightly. But yeah, I don't know who's at the very bottom of the list. Is it Germans, Russians, or South Africans? Right now, I'd say Russians, but that may not last because Russians were not at the very bottom of the list before. They were close. They've been close for a while, but I don't know. I mean, Russians do still have the World War II thing, though, whereas for Germans, that's something that's used very strongly against them. I don't know who's at the very bottom. Is it Germans, Russians, or South Africans? I don't know. You guys tell me in the comments who you think it is. But I think it would be one of those three groups. If you are a white male and you don't fit into any of the above categories and you're either German, Russian, or South African, I don't know which group it would be, but if you're in one of those categories, you'd probably be at the very, very bottom of the list. It's a bit hard to distinguish who, but yeah, that's the very bottom of the list. Those are the whites of whites, the whites who are seen as worse than other whites, because of their association with certain historical events. In the case of Germans, World War II. In the case of Russians, the current war in the Ukraine, and by extension Belarus for supporting them. In the case of Serbia, the conflict in the 90s in the Balkans. In the case of South Africa, the apartheid regime, and in the case of southern U.S., the Civil War and slavery, and Jim Crow. So yeah, that's why those whites are at the bottom of the list. But I still think the bottom of the bottom, it would be either Germans, Russians, or South Africans. I'm just not sure which. It's very hard to say at that point because you're getting so low on the list that you're in like negative points, and it's really hard to tell who's accumulated the most negative points between those groups. It's very hard to say. I'm going to say, personally, I'm going to say Germans, but I think I'm biased there because I'm mostly German myself. I would say right now it's Russians, but let me put it this way. If the war in the Ukraine ends 10, 20 years from now, it might go back to being Germans. Very, very much. And I think even with South Africans, I don't know. It's hard to say because they actually run the risk of getting killed for their race and of people celebrating it. Germans are less likely to be the recipients of actual racial violence that is directed because of their race or ethnicity specifically, whereas South Africans do have that chance. So like they might be hated less than Germans on a global scale, but they're more likely to actually have their murder unironically cheered on by leftists and liberals. They might be the most likely of anyone to have that happen to them. So maybe they're at the very bottom of the list. It could be white South Africans. It's hard to say although they will cheer on Russians getting killed in the war also, but they'll cheer on white South Africans getting killed in peacetime. So I don't know who's worse, who's lower on the list, but it's one of those groups. So yeah, that's the political correctness hierarchy from top to bottom.